In this episode, the featured film introduces the viewer to the magnificent world of William Shakespeare, fictitiously of course, gives us a glimpse of his timeless tale of star-crossed lovers, and makes us wonder what a day in the life of a genius on this scale might have been like. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Shakespeare in Love was released in 1998. The setting is London, England, Elizabethan England, which means the time period is the late 16th century, 1593 to be exact. Shakespeare in Love, therefore, is a period piece, a history, a romance, a tragedy, and a comedy, all rolled into one. But most importantly, it is a fantasy. Now, why is it a fantasy? It's a fantasy because we don't really know very much about Shakespeare, according to scholars. I mean, I know a little bit about his plays and his poetry. I studied Shakespeare in university, and I am an enormous fan of Shakespeare. But what we really know about him beyond his work apparently is not that much. Take, for example, a genius of 200 years later, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Now, first of all, it's much later, which helps. And secondly, he wrote letters. Mozart wrote letters to family, friends, and his life was quite well documented. And he had a sister, and his sister wrote letters too, to Mozart back and forth, and to other family friends, talking about Mozart's life. So there's quite a bit of information about Mozart. A genius on an enormous scale comparable, let's say, to Shakespeare. Now, there are others like that that we know a lot about, and others we know very little about. And of course, the further back in history you go, the less we know. There are contemporary references to some people, the Greeks, the playwrights of ancient Greece and Rome, but not a whole lot. But with our friend Shakespeare, we don't know too much. So it's important to appreciate that if we're going to see a movie or make a movie about Shakespeare, beyond just making a movie about his plays or a play, it is a fantasy, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be a document. It certainly is not a documentary. It is not a documentary. It's a fictional story, and the powers that be want to make a very compelling story about this time period when Shakespeare was writing, about to write, and then ultimately writing the play Romeo and Juliet. So we have to be careful that it isn't too, I guess the best word is dogmatic. This is exactly who Shakespeare was. This is what he was like. There is a portrait of Shakespeare later in his life that is extant. There are many references to Shakespeare from his contemporaries. Maybe many is the wrong word. There are some references to Shakespeare from his contemporaries. But in 1593, he was not a struggling playwright and actor. He had already acquired a reputation, but he wasn't rich by any means. He wasn't nearly as successful as I believe he would be later on, where he lived relatively comfortably. So it's a good time period to pick. And for a Shakespeare lover like myself, the movie is absolutely wonderful. So the powers that be say, we want to tell a fun, lightweight, entertaining movie about Shakespeare. And we're going to select that time period, which is the most fun we could have, which is a beautiful romantic story about the star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet. Yes, we're going to make up things. We don't really know who Shakespeare was day in and day out. We know about the theaters he worked in, and so we can be fairly accurate about them. And sure enough, when you watch the film, and I believe scholars or whoever's seen the film who knows these things may or may not have said that the theaters that the plays are done in, there is the Rose Theater, and this is spelled out at the beginning of the film. There's some written opening credits that describes the time period and the theater that Shakespeare performed his plays in at the time. For all we know, they're legit and they're accurate, and that's fine. And there are people who did exist. Shakespeare, of course. A guy named Richard Burbage, who was a contemporary, an actor, and in some ways a competitor of Shakespeare's. There were two different acting companies. There's a reference to another playwright of the period, and of course to Queen Elizabeth, a member of the aristocracy. And so we've got some real parts, and the best fictional stories about difficult subjects are often combining real people with added characters, different characters, and just creating an environment to make a good film. Let's talk about Shakespeare. I read a book that was written in the 70s by a very respected academic who said that almost everything from 300-400 years ago has faded. And I've mentioned this before, that history forgets everyone and everything. But this author, his name happens to be Alan Bloom, and the book was The Closing of the American Mind, said that Shakespeare is hanging on by a thread. And perhaps that's true, and I don't know on the release of Shakespeare in Love if Shakespeare got a boost of interest from the general public, but his work still exists. And I wondered why that was so. Just a few days ago, I spoke to a young movie watcher, and I said, first of all, have you heard of William Shakespeare? Yes, of course, was the answer. Have you ever seen a live play of Shakespeare's? The answer was no. Have you seen a movie that was one of his plays? Have you seen a movie that was a play of Shakespeare? The answer was no. Have you read any of his plays? And the answer was yes. In high school, we had to read Romeo and Juliet, and I hate that play. Well, I realized that I might have the same answers as this young viewer. I've never seen Shakespeare live. I certainly have read many of his plays. I did read Romeo and Juliet in high school. I think in high school, the idea was to pick something that was not too controversial, didn't have a lot of heavy themes. In Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers, I don't recall them emphasizing the fact that Juliet was 13 and Romeo was 15 or 16 at the time of the play. But it's got a lot of beautiful language, and I guess it's very acceptable, at least when I was in high school, for those students. So I thought, well, the difference was that after high school, when I went to university, I studied English literature. And I grew to have a tremendous affection for Shakespeare, started watching the movies because I could not or did not have the opportunity to see any of his plays live, read many of his plays in university. In fact, I had a course where the whole term, from September to May, was strictly on Shakespeare. And of course, that made me a huge Shakespeare fan, and I love everything there is to love about Shakespeare. But for these younger viewers, they have just the smallest of exposure to Shakespeare. And if I mention a few quotations or have you ever heard this or that, the answer is, for the most part, no. So that's why I think that Shakespeare in Love is a terrific introduction for the young viewer or any viewer who doesn't know a lot about Shakespeare to learn something about Shakespeare. Even if it's fictitious, the movie will show you the world of 1593 as it may or may not have been. It will be an easy introduction because the movie's actors and actresses speak in a contemporary language. They don't speak Shakespearean English, they just speak normal, current English. But when, of course, the play is being rehearsed and prepared, they do speak the actual words from the play, which is Shakespearean English. So that's a gentle start to the world of Shakespeare. Yes, they wear very different clothing, but in this particular movie, nobody looks, in terms of hairstyles or how they speak, looks foreign. They look like people who might just we might know today, except of course they dress very differently, and they're in a country in a town that looked like it did 400 years ago, now close to 450 years ago. So that's a great way to introduce people to it, part one. Okay, so we're going to make this really fun movie about a time period, whether it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks, of Shakespeare's life when he has cause to write a play about something that's happening in his real life, falling in love with someone, and then he begins to write the play Romeo and Juliet. Well, this is a dream for fans of Shakespeare because there's lots of jokes, inside jokes in the movie about Shakespeare, about show business, about playwrights, about plays, stages, actors, actresses, producers. Throughout the film, there's a lot of fun stuff. But here's the first danger. The film just can't be about that, because then you're going to alienate people who aren't fans of Shakespeare, who don't get the in-jokes, who don't know what all this is about, all this stuff. So you have to make sure the film does much, much more. And in fact, these in-jokes have to be subtle and not hit you over the head like a hammer. And in fact, those jokes are very subtle, and they're a whole lot of fun. So what we have to add is a romance, never a bad thing, and comedy, because the tone of the film has to be light. And I'll say this again, as I've said many times, I don't think there's anything harder when you write a story or make a film to find the right tone for the film. We want to tell a story that's really gripping and intense, about a lot of suffering and pain, and so the tone has to reflect that. It can't be light, and unless you're making gallows humor kind of a comedy. And then if you say, we're going to make a story about Elizabethan England in 1593, and it's kind of a rough time to be alive. The plague was around, a lot of people died recently, and that's even touched on in Shakespeare in Love. But we want it to be fun. And the magic word here is it's a celebration of all those things I mentioned. Shakespeare in Love is a celebration of Shakespeare, a celebration of art, a celebration of acting, a celebration of all the behind-the-scenes elements of a play. So we add a story and a comedy and the tone that allows for new viewers who don't know Shakespeare that well to also enjoy this story. And the tone is amazing because at the beginning of the play, there's a scene that could easily be done in a certain way, which is very violent and serious and unpleasant. But even though it is what it is, I wouldn't say it's laugh out loud funny, but it's lightweight. So how difficult is that? You'd have to ask yourself, to depict a scene where someone is being punished for being late on a bill, and yet somehow the movie, at the very opening scene, the movie brings it up. This very opening scene that is potentially, or that certainly looks violent, actually sets the tone for the rest of the film, which is lightweight, fun, and comedic. Now that's not easy to do, and Shakespeare in Love does that spectacularly well. Our introduction to Shakespeare is from Shakespeare in Love. We're a new viewer. We don't know too much about Shakespeare. We certainly don't know much about the 16th century in England, so the movie's going to help us with that. They're going to entertain us with a really fun story, a romantic story full of lots of comedy, very clever comedy, and also will showcase Shakespeare's talent through a play called Romeo and Juliet. Now, it's hard to explain, I suppose, to people who aren't exposed to Shakespeare, because Shakespeare, for most people, the language of Shakespeare, it's a foreign language. So let's say it is that, but it's probably the easiest foreign language to learn because it is English. There's only English words in it, but it is different. It is spoken different. It is language of a play. But once you get your toes wet and step into the waters of Shakespeare, you start to follow it better, and as you get exposed to it more, you tend to understand it better. And what better way to do that than have a movie with a play within the story, about how the play was written, rehearsals, actors going through the lines more than once. It really introduces you to this language. So I'd have to say that one of the aspects of Shakespeare that native speakers can really enjoy, and non-native speakers can enjoy once they reach the level where they can appreciate Shakespeare, is the music of the language. And this is something I read in an essay from George Orwell. He did an essay about the play King Lear. He talked about Tolstoy and other things. And he said that's one of the things that non-native speakers who don't know English and who study Shakespeare in a different language initially fail to appreciate. They might say, yeah, I get it. Like, for example, Kenneth Clark said that Voltaire's French is spectacular and it's so pleasant on the ear and so clever in his word choices. And if you don't speak French, you'll never appreciate it to that level. Well, the same is true of Shakespeare. Orwell talks about the music of the language, how the words just seem to flow, how they're connected so perfectly. So I'm going to give you a few examples and then tell you what happened with these examples. The first one is, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, I look upon myself and curse my fate. There's one. Now, there's a play more than one play in which Shakespeare created a very famous character who has lived down through the ages. A big, overweight, robust, jolly, heavy drinking, partying fellow, and his name was Falstaff. And he hung out with his buddies, and one of his buddies was an errant ne'er-do-well, son of the King of England, and his name was Hal. And for a couple of plays, he's called Prince Hal, and he is Falstaff's drinking buddy. But at one point, the king dies, and Prince Hal becomes King Henry V, and he can't be a drinking buddy anymore. And there's a moment where Falstaff laments the fact that he's lost his friend, and he says, in a pleading sort of way, "But we have heard the chimes at midnight." And that's number 2. Number 3 is Julius Caesar. After the assassination of Caesar, I don't think we need a spoiler alert for this one. And he says the stuff that many people who know a little bit about Shakespeare know: friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come here not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. And then he says, the evil that men do lives on after them. Let's jump to the next one, where in Macbeth, he speculates on life. And he says, at one point, a rather long soliloquy, that's one person talking in the play. And finally he says, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And then my last one is from Hamlet, in which Hamlet, again, like he did throughout most of the play, speculating on life and death, says, to sleep, to die, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come. Now these are all quotations from Shakespeare that I have done with passion and without talent, but what is notable about these quotations is every one of them contains phrases that were used as titles of either movies or books, which means that other authors, or every author, recognizes the music and the catchiness, with terrible thing, but the catchiness of these phrases. Every one of those quotations contains words that are either used as movie titles or book titles. The sound and the fury, what dreams may come, the evil that men do, the chimes at midnight, fortune in men's eyes. So that's the music of Shakespeare, and as you get exposed to it, you tend to appreciate more. And there are literally hundreds more of the most incredible lines. Shakespeare wrote over 100 sonnets, and they are what they are. And he wrote, I think, 30 plays, more than 30 plays. And in my university years, I studied a bunch of them, and since I graduated, I've read even more. So again, for the new viewer, the one who introducing to Shakespeare, You get to follow along with these characters who speak just like us, but then when they rehearse the play and prepare the play, they speak Shakespearean English. And it's like, wait a minute, it's different, but okay, now I sort of get bits and pieces of that. I understand it better. And yeah, like, what's in a name? A rose smells just as sweet. That's from Romeo and Juliet. And there are some other parts of Romeo and Juliet that even the high school students probably remember. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And a balcony scene that is very, very famous. So, the music of Shakespeare, more than anything else, his language, is what I hope a new viewer watching Shakespeare in Love can appreciate. As the regular viewer knows, I'm a big fan of good titles. And they don't make or break a film, but they can take a film to a higher level. And I find it amusing that in this movie, there are many inside jokes about good titles. They talk about good titles. Somebody mentions a character's name. They talk about a good name, which means they also talk about bad titles and bad names. I wonder if this has not existed from the dawn of time of recorded fiction up to our present day, where the title and the names of characters are important. Certainly there is a joke about it in Shakespeare in Love, but that doesn't mean that there is actual reference to the fact that writers troubled themselves over calling someone Romeo or calling them some other name, or Hamlet. Why did Shakespeare call Hamlet Hamlet and not his son's name, which I believe is Hamnet? But I'd like to think that it did matter to them. And even though we may not have any documentary proof that this is the case, perhaps it was the case that even as far as 2,500 years ago, when the great Greek playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and all the rest of them would argue over titles of plays and titles of characters and decide whether or not they were catchy, whether they rolled off the tongue, whether they were accurately represented the play they were about to write, right up until the time of the Elizabethan age, when so many plays and so much poetry was written, right up to our present day. Perhaps in many, many, many years hence, with accents yet unknown, might discover that in fact there is documentary proof that the playwrights and writers from 2,500 years ago to the present day worried about good titles. And I say again, I love good titles, and it is so charming to see in Shakespeare in Love a lot of jokes about good titles as opposed to bad titles, and good names of characters as opposed to bad names of characters. Shakespeare in Love is a story about Shakespeare and his love when he decides and while he is writing the play Romeo and Juliet. The viewer gets a glimpse of one of Shakespeare's plays. On the screen there have been many, many, many adaptations of Shakespeare's plays. Hamlet has been made several times. I could go down the list of Richard III, Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing, so many, and many of them are just wonderful. Julius Caesar. I like very much Julius Caesar. I've seen Antony and Cleopatra, not the Cleopatra made in the early 60s, which I like very much, the one with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, but there was one made with Charlton Heston I think was a very decent Shakespearean film. Hamlet, the one by Kenneth Branagh, I think is wonderful. Macbeth, there's been many, many, many versions of Macbeth, a Japanese film and English films, of course. And it just is a real treasure trove of movie watching that once the viewer gets exposed to Shakespeare, can sort of say, okay, it's not as much of a foreign language as it used to be. And I can kind of understand what's going on, and maybe I want to understand it better. Because the real trick about enjoying Shakespeare is not the stories. There's no mysteries, there's no, oh, that's a really cool story, I didn't know how it was going to end. Most of the time when people go to see a play by Shakespeare or a movie from one of his plays, they may not know everything about the movie, but they know plenty. So it's really about the language of the play and how well the play transfers from the stage to the screen, and that is very, very difficult. I have many favorites. Branagh's Hamlet, which is relatively recent, and the Romeo and Juliet that I like the most, that I think is just stunning, is the one directed by Franco Zeffirelli and released in 1968. I watched it in preparation for this podcast, and it really does a tremendous job. It goes into a lot of detail. It follows the play quite religiously, but not exclusively. Very few movies about Shakespeare film the plays word for word. One exception, a very famous exception, is Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet. I don't think he left out one word in the play, and it is over 4 hours long with an intermission. But as I said, there's a treasure trove waiting for the viewer who gets their feet wet with Shakespeare in Love, say, hey, there's something going on here, sees the play enacted inside the movie, sees the response from the audience and from the more jaded figures of London that the story charmingly promotes, people who are not into plays, people who are violently opposed to them, and then being totally taken in by this film, something to look forward to. So the powers that be have an idea of how they want to put this movie together. We're going to make a light comedy. It's going to include Romeo and Juliet, so there's a tragic element to it. No dry eyes in the house by the end of the film. We're going to have it be a celebration and a send-up of the world of the stage, of actors and actresses, of playwrights, of the producers who are the nasty but necessary people. There's a wonderful moment in the play when one of the actors returns from tour and doesn't like to see anybody he doesn't know, and he says to one character, "Who are you?" And the actor or the person says, "I'm the money." And so the actor says, "You can stay." So there's many fun moments like that. So we have the tone, even from this incredible opening scene that suggests this might be a very different movie, but it's not. It's very lightweight. It really moves along, and it starts off with Shakespeare in Love, much like the play Romeo and Juliet starts off with Shakespeare in Love. But there's a trick, or a real change in direction, and that change in direction in Shakespeare's real life in the movie is who he's in love with changes. And in Romeo and Juliet, who he's absolutely infatuated with as a young 15, 16-year-old also changes. And this is done really very cleverly. So the writing of the story, I think, again, as I will say forever, is just exceptional. This is not an easy thing to do, to write about Shakespeare, to not worry about whether or not it's factual or not factual, and not too fictional, not too crazy fictional, but and at the same time engaging the audience. So the writing is wonderful. Like I said, the fans of Shakespeare love all the references, the inside jokes, the frustrations that a writer like Shakespeare may or may not have had. He's depicted in the movie as successful but not overly confident, because there are many rivals. Elizabethan England was a high point for literature, unparalleled, I think, with Shakespeare, a fellow by the name of Christopher Marlowe, and there's many more that for most people are lost again in the fog of time. But there is a running joke about Christopher Marlowe, who is deemed to be the best playwright of the era, more so than Shakespeare. And so they handle that very, very well. The story also has to find a way to intertwine all these conflicts, little conflicts in the movie, with the need to write a play and have the actors act it out and get paid, have the writer get paid, Shakespeare, have the stage manager pay off his debts, and have the producer get paid his debts and also make some money. And it flows along wonderfully. And so we have the plot device in the movie is a love story. And that love story is not Romeo and Juliet's, but it sort of kind of is Romeo and Juliet's, although they're adults. It's an adult Shakespeare who meets and falls in love with an aristocratic woman. So an aristocratic woman. Let's talk about the cast. And as I've said, I think casting a movie is absolutely critical. I mean, you could say all parts of a movie are critical, but some movies can have a terrific script and a so-so cast because maybe a very, very popular, powerful actor wants to play this role and may or may not be right for it. And there's a joke about that in Shakespeare in Love. And maybe there's a great cast of people you think this movie is going to be a slam dunk success because look at all these great stars, and yet the script lets them down or something lets them down and the movie is not successful. Well, in this case, we have an actor who I don't think was really well known at the time. And this film, as I said, was released in 1998, and many of the people in this film are still alive. Today's movie watcher will probably recognize the name Ben Affleck. He's in this film. He plays Mercutio. Gwyneth Paltrow is in this film. Now, whether or not you're a fan of Gwyneth Paltrow these days, in 1998, she just looked like an aristocrat, utterly gorgeous, long golden blonde hair halfway down her back. I think was an excellent choice to play both the aristocrat and somebody else. Shakespeare was a guy named Ralph Fiennes, got a really hard name to pronounce. Young man, of course, like all stars, very good looking, does a lot of running in this movie. I guess he was a good runner, and for some reason they wanted to see him running all over the place, and he does. But the cast is huge, and there's many parts to it. Many wonderful actors that moviegoers from the 1990s and the 2000s would recognize. Tom Wilkinson has a tremendously important role. He passed away just recently, sadly. Geoffrey Rush, still alive, who people might know from The King's Speech and other films. He is the proprietor, the man who puts on the plays in the Rose Theatre. He has a very critical central role. And Colin Firth, who plays a wonderfully charming bad guy. And as I mentioned, this film is not nasty, it's a celebration, it's wonderful, it's joyous, but Firth manages to pull off being a bad guy inside this joyous film. And that's not easy to do, and I think that's partly because his part was written so well and because Colin Firth is such an accomplished actor. Right from the beginning of the film, we like who we see. We like the proprietor of the theater. We like Shakespeare. We like his friends. We like the other actors who are involved. Sometime into the film, the character played by Ben Affleck appears. There's Richard Burbage, who's the competition. There's another central character who was very highly rated in this film, although she has very little screen time, but is a central figure, and that, of course, is Queen Elizabeth. And her role is small, but absolutely central to keeping the plot going, to create problems, and ultimately to have a wonderful final 10 minutes of the film. Absolutely wonderful final 10 minutes of the film. And that actress's name is Judi Dench. You probably know her from, if you're a new viewer, from the James Bond films of the last 15, 20 years. She played M. And she was very acclaimed for her role, and I think won an award for it. But regardless of that, she just does a terrific job. So we've got this cast just hitting on all cylinders, cliche, but doing a terrific job, moving the story forward. And there's tension, there's conflict in the film. Because it is a period piece, we know that Romeo and Juliet is going to be written and it's going to be finished and it's going to be a success, but we don't know how that's going to turn out in the film. And the film pokes fun at the fact that it may not turn out, whereas other characters say, don't worry, it will turn out. How? I don't know, it just will. So this is what we have. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So as a lover of Shakespeare, I approached this film with some cynicism. I thought, oh, not another movie about what Shakespeare was really like. Was he an aristocrat masquerading as a player? Was he an ordinary fellow with lots of bad habits? This movie, as it turned out, wasn't interested in any of those things. They just wanted to celebrate everything. They wanted to tell a fun story, tongue-in-cheek in places, just a fun story about writing a play by someone who is, well, it's an understatement, a bona fide genius. And as I said, it is a tremendous vehicle to introduce people to Shakespeare who otherwise would not know Shakespeare. At the time of its release, the actors, the stars of the film were well known, but then again, people would say Shakespeare, you know, and they might stay away from it, but the stars would have been an attraction. And as I said, the film did very, very well. It was very well received for the most part. Some people thought it was too lightweight, maybe, but I find it hits the perfect tone. And for me, rather than ending up feeling cynical about it, I just couldn't believe how wonderful a film that was, as someone who knows more than some about Shakespeare and less than others, of course. But I really, really enjoyed this film. And just like Romeo and Juliet, I would argue, you just don't want this movie to end. But of course, because it's a play about a play or a movie about a play, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And so the film is going to end, the play is going to end, in the case of Romeo and Juliet, as we know, and it says at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet that our star-crossed lovers are going to be dead by the end of this play. So it's a funny thing if you think about it in storytelling. We're going to tell you what happens right in the first 2 minutes of our story, but it's the telling of the story and following these characters and falling in love with these characters that makes it so worthwhile. And that's exactly what happens in Shakespeare in Love. What we don't know is going to happen, which I say again is a benefit for the new viewer, is we don't know what's going to happen in the romance of the film between Shakespeare and the woman he falls in love with at some point in this film. Will they run away together? Are their lives going to be a tragedy in that they can never marry? The rules at the time are aristocrats marry either other aristocrats or royalty. Commoners, of whom playwrights and actors were very much commoners. And there's lots of jokes about how actors are 10 a penny and playwrights are the same. And so they're not, movies love to make fun of these things, to say that, well, we're all actors and writers and all that, but we're going to say lines like everybody hates actors, everybody looks down on playwrights and show business in general, because it's a very inferior form of entertainment, even in 16th century England, Elizabethan England, when literature, as I say, might have been as robust and as marvelous as it has ever been. So they pull it off, and it's just a wonderful ride. And I've seen the film several times. I hope the person I spoke to a few days ago who hated Romeo and Juliet but didn't realize that this film existed might take a chance and watch this movie. So I would urge them to sit back, relax, and watch Shakespeare in Love. In the 22nd row.